Thank you for that introduction. By way of background, it's all, as was said there, I started off in general practice, but at one stage I wanted to be a surgeon, but I found I liked talking to people more than sticking knives in them, so I changed my direction. And certainly in the last few years my research and my focus has been on professionalism, but particularly around development of professional identity. And we've got some ongoing research going on at the University of Adelaide which will be looking at that. I should say I'm still Director Learning and Teaching, although I'm on leave from the university for the moment, and at the end of that leave I'll be retiring. But I'll be continuing to supervise my PhD students, etc., and keep involved in academia. So, yeah. Okay, just to talk, we can go back to the 90s when we look at social media, electronic engagement, etc. I did some training in family therapy, a 2-year course, and the team teaching us had a huge collection of videotapes of therapy sessions, but we were not allowed to take them out of the building to take home and look at them, because a few years prior they had used, with consent of the family, a videotape to show an example of something at a course. At the end of the course someone said, "I'd like to borrow that tape, can I take it and show the people back in my area?" Now, this was done in Adelaide, and the person doing the talking, requesting, was from a remote area in Queensland. And so they thought, no, there won't be any problem with that. But of course, as happens when you do something like that, who should be sitting in the front row of the audience in the country town in Queensland but the sister of the person on the screen? And it just happens so easily. The whole area of professionalism, even for highly professional people, can sometimes just hit us if we're not careful. So what I want to do today is look at professionalism in the digital age. But I want to start off by asking a few questions. Okay. How many of you are baby boomers? As it says there, so a few of you. Right. I can add me to that list. Gen Xers, a few more of you. What about Gen Ys? So a few Gen Ys, also known as millennials, and they're also divided into Y1 and Y2. That's generally around based on how settled they are and how much money they've got, the Gen 2s. But how many, I don't think we've got any Gen Zs here, have we? Some of your students may be Gen Zs, but even some of those will be having trouble. They're also known as Gen Tech, iGens, post-millennials, or Gen Wi-Fi. So there's a move away from using the alphabet, and in fact we're going to run out of alphabet very quickly anyway. Okay. Now, just so I get a feel for where the audience is, who regularly uses Facebook? And by regularly I mean 2-3 times a week. Quite a lot of you. I should say I've got a Facebook account, but I only use it to order from companies that only have Facebook accounts. Twitter? A few of you. Yeah, Twitter seems to be on the outer these days. It's really, and it irritates me immensely. Snapchat? No Snapchatters here? Instagram? A few of you. LinkedIn? A lot more. Probably one of the poorest websites they've got going, but it does seem to work for some people. Any others that people use? Right. Sorry? WhatsApp. Okay. As you can see from the picture there, there's a whole lot of different options that people can use, and they seem to come and go as people get interested in them. Okay, the next question is probably the most important. What's the interval between when you wake up and when you first look at your social media? Is it before you get out of bed? Anyone in that group? Yes, we've got a few. Okay. Now, if you go back to smoking, in smoking, if you had a cigarette within 5 minutes of waking up, you were definitely addicted. So less than 5 minutes? Okay. 5 to 15, a few of you. 15 to 30? No, you're either doing it very quickly. 30 to 60, or when you get to work. There's quite a few that I know that nowadays that wait till they get to work, but a lot of people, first thing they do is look at their mobile phone or their iPad or whatever. And there's actually a movement afoot to not take your phone into the bedroom. Although one of my deans used to put the phone under her pillow. And she lived on about 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. And did some really intense medicine. Okay, so we can see how people use and feel it. How many of you got your phones turned off at the moment? So it doesn't make a sound. Some of you, right, good. I've often threatened my students I'm going to do a study of ringtones and see what it means psychologically, depending on which ringtone you've got. But one of the problems that's coming up with the use of social media is this issue of employers, hospitals, going to social media and checking on people who are joining them or applying for them. And people are having trouble getting rid of it because once it's on there, it tends to stay. And this was written in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 2012. And it does apply to a lot of our students. I'm staying at the Capri Hotel and they're holding a couple of conferences there. One is on the importance of mangroves in fish breeding, etc. And so there's all these young enthusiastic students and running around taking photos of everything, you know, the tea room, the front reception. I'm thinking, why are they doing that? Of course, it's going on their Facebook page. It documents where they've been and where they're going. But when it gets worse, that it actually starts to become problematic. It's a bit like, I use emails as most of my online stuff, and at times you write an email and then you wait 1 hour or 5 hours or 24 hours before you consider sending it, and mostly you get rid of it and rewrite it at that stage after you've calmed down. But sometimes with social media it's so immediate. But I don't think social media actually changes professionalism. It just expands the ways in which you can be unprofessional. And quite a few students coming through, I mean, they have enough trouble with professionalism anyway, but add to that the social media, it just makes it a whole lot worse. And we'll look at some of that later on. But I'm going to give you some examples. This is taken from, this and the next few are taken from the AMA in Western Australia in a publication they've developed for medical students. It's really quite good, but they use a number of examples. And students get quite mortified when they think they're being confidential. They're not putting people's names up, they're not putting hospitals on there, but they forget the sequence of events often allows people to track them and to work out where they are and who the patient was. And as you can see here, it's just sometimes it's not even malicious, it's just people going online to get some information and all this other stuff comes up. And this is really important for students. We've had students who've found it difficult to understand confidentiality in that sense. It doesn't always require social networking, etc. I've had a student who very carefully changed a person's name but left all the other details about him unchanged, and I could recognise it just after I started reading. There's not many people in Australia who are dedicated rugby union followers, and particularly the British Lions. And I just knew this guy, I just knew that would happen. And then it got worse because I didn't bother to change his wife's name, and it was most unusual name. So people can get, and the student was actually quite mortified. He just hadn't realised that by putting all that information, the same happens here. But sometimes it can get quite blatant. This is based on, the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but on an actual social networking post. And you can imagine that that is really, it's defamation basically. And, but you can imagine an intern who's struggled with his patient to be just totally annoyed with the registrar who didn't do it, but to go public with it. And this intern actually thought it was a private network, but they're never really private. This is the other one that's starting to come up more and more. Having your patients friend you as a doctor. And it keeps doctors on their toes when you find that you've suddenly got patients as your friends. And it becomes quite difficult. And the General Medical Council and a few others have made comments about it, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And then there are sometimes other issues, like just getting so pissed off with the world that you send off your email or you make a post, and it becomes difficult for the people involved. So that just sort of sets some of the scene. There are some much simpler. Okay, so the General Medical Council gives people advice on how to act with. Sorry, did I miss one there? No. Okay. And this is advice that they've put together for students and doctors, because we're finding some of the younger doctors are having trouble with this as well. And you are still a doctor or a medical student on social media. And that's really important to remember. Now, it doesn't apply everywhere. In discussions I've had with other people on relation to professional behaviour, in Australia, once you're a medical student, you're a medical student, wherever you are, and if you misbehave outside the medical school, you can get yourself into trouble with the medical board. In some countries, that's not the case. In the Netherlands, and particularly the Scandinavian countries, if you do something unprofessional and it's within the medical school, that will be dealt with. Outside the medical school, doesn't come up. And I found that quite difficult. We actually asked the question, if someone killed someone else, could they still be a medical student? The answer was yes. I would have significant trouble. Protecting patient confidentiality is also very important. And you'll notice places like the British Medical Journal now, they have to have patient consent for any picture relating to a patient, be it a chest x-ray, a lesion on the back of a hand, because sometimes people can be identified, and I'm going to talk about some in a minute. And it's so easy to undermine someone's confidentiality. The GMC has strict guidelines on taking and sharing pictures of patients or where you work. The issue around where you work allows it to be identified, which narrows down the number of patients. But also the other issue is sometimes there are patients in those pictures. Maybe not patients you're involved with, but that can, you can imagine that leading to some difficulties if it gets out at times. These are fairly standard. Maintain your professional boundaries, even online. Think before you share, which is probably the most important one of the lot. And think about whether you post anonymously as a doctor or identify yourself. What do you think the GMC's suggestion is? The GMC actually suggests that you identify yourself to make it more professional, to identify where it's coming from, the comment or that. And also be very cautious giving medical advice on social media. So what I'm going to do now is get you to do some work. This comes from the Canadian Medical Students Fellowship, and they've set up these cases for discussion. Okay. Now the question is this a problem? As teachers, your feeling about this. Is he in problem? What would you do with him? No, I see a few heads shaking. No, he's not. It would be very different if he was in his underwear and blind drunk and vomiting and the school had been identified. But something like that, I mean, it's something that is not out of character. Can you do the next one? I can understand this person's anguish. Again, what do you think? I see some saying no.
Not appropriate.
Not appropriate, no. It's not an appropriate comment. It displays the doctor as being really quite difficult with patients, not caring about patients, and so it's something that is inappropriate, and you would want to talk to the student. What do you think?
You have to get permission from the boss.
Yep. I mean, the comment there was you have to have permission from above. He's nominated a school, and writing that in a public domain gives the impression it's the opinion of the school, and that's inappropriate. But again, it's something he did when he was incensed. Just dashed it off, and really trying to put it together can get you into trouble.
Would it be appropriate if he didn't put?
If he puts it as his own opinion,
it's his view, not the view.
it's his view, and he's entitled to have that view, but really it shouldn't be attributed to the school or the university.
Because people would know.
Oh yeah.
You could Google him and know where he is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he probably wants to tone it down and think about it, but we shouldn't stop doctors being doing things to support patients, but they just need to be careful how they do it. This is again becoming far more common. What would you do as Maya?
Just ignore the friend.
That's right. Not accept the friend request, because you can do that, and otherwise you'll end up with patients and sometimes even very creepy patients wanting to follow you around. And it may be best if you didn't see the patient again at the clinic. I've had female GPs approach me that they're being harassed, if I can use that term, by male patients. And so whenever they turn up, she wasn't available and I saw them. That stopped it pretty quickly. They weren't attracted to me in one little way. But it's really can be a problem. And if this person's going to come back to the dermatology clinic, luckily she will move on anyway somewhere else, but I've heard of cases where they've followed. Okay, last one. This comes down to an issue that comes up quite a lot with students, is should they just accept it and do nothing, or should they do something? If it is to do something, what is it that you should do? And it doesn't just apply here to online stuff, it can apply in the real world as well. So what the student then has to just think about, what do they do about this? And the easy way out is to do nothing. But you've got to live with yourself, and if it's inappropriate behaviour, you need to work with that. You need to be able to intervene in a way, so whether you talk to the other students, or whether you talk to your supervisors, or whether you talk to a mentor, you've got to do something. And there's no single answer that would work. I work with a couple of people in America. They run a psychology service. He's an organisational psychologist who works with hospitals, medical boards, setting up programs for people with doctors with behavioural problems. And she works as a clinical psychologist dealing with doctors who have been referred by medical boards. Her whole practice relates to doctors. And it's so traumatic, it's turned one of her registrars off ever becoming a doctor. He was thinking about doing medicine, but he's given up. And she's actually started to develop processes by which people, if you see someone doing something you feel uncomfortable with, you can, there are steps you can take immediately to do something about it. And the same applies online. But you have to be careful. You don't want to end up in a slanging match online and then be trolled, etc. In the Australian press today, there was a story of a lawyer who took her daughter to a male barber to get her hair trimmed, and he refused to do it because she was a girl. And so she was a lawyer, so she ended up going through the Human Rights Commission, and it was successfully resolved. But then it was published online, and she was trolled unmercilessly. She found there were threats, as there are with this. It was really quite difficult for her to deal with. And it can become really quite offensive. Okay, thanks. Okay, so there are lots of these lists published, but what do you do to protect yourself online? Firstly, if you're going to go online, publish lots of good things. So that outweighs the bad things that go on with you, and that you can, when people search your name, they get lots of good material, not the bad material. It comes back to this process of the search engine optimization. You need ways of overcoming the tendency for people to look at the lurid or the provocative. Thanks. And this is where a lot of students go wrong. They think they set their privacy settings, but they're not private. And even if you set them with the highest levels of security and privacy settings, people can still get through. Funny things will happen. And I'll show you an example a little bit later. Next one, thanks. The other thing these two doctors thought about was we need to make sure that untrue and slanderous material is removed. And that means quite often a concerted effort to make it happen. And if patients are following you online, it's probably worthwhile having a discussion with them about how it's inappropriate and you feel uncomfortable with it. Now, whether that's going to have any effect and whether you can stop it is a separate issue. And have you ever done a vanity search? That is, you searched your own name. Most people have at some stage. I must just say I'm most disappointed with mine. Mine mostly consists of published papers, not much else, occasional picture. But some people do that and get really quite shocked by what they find online. And it's worth doing just to check what's there about you. Particularly if you're going for a job in the near future, it's very worthwhile looking at. Okay. The problem we seem to run into is that students come into medicine with a really well entrenched media habits. They've developed these over the years, and it is something that's just part of their life. They just like being able to interact with other people online. And when they get to medicine, it's really difficult for them to give some of those things up. If they see something interesting, they want to put it up online so everyone can share it. If they see something a bit unusual, or a bit gross or whatever, they want to put it up because they want to share it with other people. And it sometimes takes time to get through the message that you need to be so careful with what you put online. So what can you do about it? Okay, most important thing, as with all professionalism, you need to tell people what's unprofessional. There is an argument in the literature about what is being professional. Is it something inherent in all of us? It's an innate thing within us, or is it a set of behaviours which we can teach? And there's a whole argument that goes on. I mean, it reached the point where the Australian Medical Council says being a professional is something inherent in all of it, in the professional doctor, which we measure by looking at the behaviours. So it's having a bit both ways. But at times, even with the most professional student, you need to explain why something's unprofessional. It may not be a conscious thing. I find with students, one of the biggest discussions I have is around dual relationships. Why you shouldn't use the accountant who comes to you as a patient as your accountant, or one of your patients as a gardener, or whatever. They don't understand, and it's not until you actually explain it they start to understand it. The problem they then run into, always bring up, is, well, I'm a solo doctor in a small country town, what do I do? And that is a problem, but it's being very aware of it. But you need to sit down with the students and explain to them why doing certain things is unprofessional. And repeat it. And repeat it. Do it at the beginning of every semester, every year, every block, whatever, so that the message keeps getting across to students. Initially there will be breaches, but if you respond to them in a educational way, so that you actually use it as a teaching opportunity, you'll engage the students and hopefully bring them along with you. But if for someone who repeatedly breaches, or particularly egregious breaches, react promptly and firmly. And this means often setting up or involving your fitness to practice committee or your progression committee in managing some of these issues. And remember, it's often not what is posted, it's the student's attitude to it. Can I put the next one up? This is one that's received a lot of publicity about a number of students who set up a WhatsApp group to share stories about patients and stuff. It was seen as set up as a comedy thing, as a funny thing, as look at this weird thing. Mohammed stepped outside that. He had a story of a person dressed as an elf who got injured, and he showed pictures, etc. He didn't use the patient's name, but he did describe the symptoms and the circumstances. It got shared off his Facebook page and into a whole lot of other areas. Now the problem was, if this has come from the General Medical Council, is if you go through the case, the university decided it'd better investigate. So it did. It went to the students. Mohammed was just totally apologetic. He hadn't realised what was going on. He didn't understand. He was really felt he had been inappropriate. But Sarah, who set up the WhatsApp things, really just said, well, what's the bother? No one's been hurt. It's really okay. And no amount of counselling could change that. She just believed everyone was old fuddy-duddies, not being involved, not understanding modern world. So she ended up being stood down from the university for 6 months and had to undertake a whole lot of behavioural and professional training. Mohammed and the other members of the students got a slap over the wrist and told not to do it again, but it was a very good learning message for them. So it really can be the student's response to it, not the actual event that's the issue. The other thing that can be done, we've implemented an ethical issue arising from Facebook use into our selection interview. And the person who runs our selection interviews says, you might as well just do that one. About 50% of students do not see the ethical issue that runs through that, and they're the ones you don't want in the program. It becomes very discriminating. And remember that you're role models. And this goes back to a lot of professional teaching, is that you are a role model, and what the students see you doing, they will take as being acceptable. Be very careful about friending students and potential students. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but it is a real recipe for disaster if you start friending students during the course. I'll leave you with this thought, that what all it has done is hasn't changed the professionalism, but it's changed how we respond to it. It just complicates things a bit further. It's just some other issue we need to talk about with our students. And it's really important that we're right up front with the students, and they are helped to understand the issues that come up. I think, okay, my voice is starting to give out. I've talked so much the last few days, and I'll stop at that point, but I'm happy to answer any questions, ask you any questions, lead to discussions about this issue. So over to you.
Can I ask, as a HOD, how do you respond to students attacking your staff anonymously on confessions websites about their performance, etc., when it could even be another staff member with a grudge? So yeah. How do you filter that out and deal with it?
It is not something that's happened very commonly, but we do see it. I mean, the hard bit is always tracking down who's doing it. As you said, it may not be who it seems to be. And if you're going to respond to it, you need to almost do that forensic sort of investigation. It's getting stuff taken down isn't easy. It's really quite difficult at times, and the person who put it up needs to be the one to take it down. So there are some very good technical people that can track these sort of things down, and you need that information to be able to do anything. It's gone.
How do you re-motivate the staff member who might be very back like this?
Yeah, I mean, it can be very undermining. I mean, those of you that are on social media a lot, you may actually see the trolls and the trolling that goes on, and that is very, very difficult to manage. And it's basically trying to work with that member of staff who's been attacked for being incompetent, or something like the one I showed here about you almost killed this patient, but if you keep going you should be able to help her by providing kidneys and lungs, etc. It's like when something major goes wrong with a colleague, you need to sit down and work with them. And if it's this, you need to work through it with them. And it is not something that's easy. I'm not saying it is. And it may be something that you need someone from outside to come in and help you deal with it. but it's so variable, it's hard to work on.
How about a policy of everything that's anonymous on social media is ignored?
You can, I don't know if you heard that comment back up there, that anything on social media is ignored. That would be good, except people don't ignore it, and that's the problem. I mean, it's very easy to say, look, just ignore that, but it's just so difficult to do. Yes?
That's very interesting here. I just think sometimes we don't always agree on what is acceptable to share on social media and what is not. So I think the younger generation, for example, may find quite a lot of things quite acceptable, whereas the baby boomers like myself might be a bit more sort of conservative. Which then brings me back to the issue of selection of students and giving them a scenario and asking them to say whether that's acceptable or not. So potentially you have an interviewer who might think, this is totally unacceptable, whereas for the candidate, it might be something that is quite acceptable.
As I say to the students, they live in a world where they're in a rapidly changing area, but the baby boomers are still in control. And the baby boomers set the rules, basically. Now that's slowly changing as the baby boomers reach their 70s and start dropping off the other side. But you're right, it is really, people do vary. And it's, for an organisation, it's getting a consistent message out to the students about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. When I talked about my student who wrote a paper about a patient and he changed the name of, when I talked to him, he was really upset that he'd managed to reveal who the patient was to me. Now, it was unusual because I knew this patient, but he understood then there's a whole lot more to just confidentiality than just changing the name. There are pictures that can give you hints. There are people's interests and hobbies that may help you. It's that, working through those things can be very, very difficult. And if you start, some of the younger people looking at it will think that that's quite okay to share it. It's on a so-called private site, but so often those private sites aren't private. And once it's on there, it's very difficult to remove. Very, very difficult. Says he, talking from experience of trying to get things changed. Yes?
At what stage of the student's education do you think it's appropriate to teach about professionalism? Like when you are primary to do it?
Okay. It depends a bit on the program. I think as soon as students are starting to interact with patients, they need discussions of professionalism. I'll give you an example. In University of Sydney, about 3 years ago, they had a project where the students had to go out and see a patient and interview that patient 3 or 4 times during the year and then write a report. And they got back some really good reports, so good that they actually wanted to go and thank the patients for being involved. When they did that, they got letters back saying, look, this patient's been dead for 5 years. The students had concocted these stories. Now, that's nothing to do with online stuff, but the conversation about professional behaviour needs to start before they start interacting with those patients. Now, that was done in in second year, so very early. We have our students going out to see patients in first year, so we start before that, because they do need that sort of advice. I mean, non-medically, we've had an anatomy student who was so excited about his And what he was doing in the anatomy laboratory, he held this very loud conversation in a coffee lounge with someone. And there was a bit of uproar. When he was talked to, again, he was really upset that he was just excited, just so excited about it, that he had to talk to someone about it. And people, sometimes their emotions and feelings take over. And it's very difficult then to bring that back. And again, students will often, as I said, they will often understand some of the professionalism, but not all of it. As first year students decided to go on a pub crawl, the annual pub crawl for first year students, typically Australian thing. They were very good about it. They had 2 people attending who weren't drinking, who made sure everyone stayed safe, made sure that no one drove, did all those things. The only trouble was they wore hospital garb, theatre garb. And there were about half a dozen complaints went into the local hospital about the doctors misbehaving. The hospital went, what's going on? Eventually they tracked it down and worked out it was our students. We got a stinking letter from them. We talked to the students, they went, oh, hadn't thought of that. It doesn't happen now. They still go on the pub crawl, but they don't do it in hospital garb. So it's sometimes just sitting with them to explain those sort of issues that's so helpful. And it needs to start before they get too far into the system. I certainly wouldn't be leaving it till the last year. I believe it should be started right at the beginning. The difficulty you find is the literature that gives you no advice on how to teach it. The literature also gives you no advice on what it is. But we've just about to publish another article that looks at assessing it, which starts to give some advice about how to assess it. But overall, it's a very difficult area to teach and to think about. And it's really important that it starts early and it's repeated and followed throughout the course. And it must be dealt with as you go through the course. No, my voice is giving up. Yes?
Understanding that this needs to be a repetitive message, but you did mention about having a guideline. So what sort of guideline that should be given and when should it be given to the written guidelines, formal guidelines, besides, the regular reminders?
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of guidelines around, and I think most universities are now developing their own. I think they need to be given to them in paper form, which they see, but you also got to put them online. They're far more likely to.
So we have actually it's in the e-learning portal, but I think the point that for me is a missing link is the repeated messaging. So it's actually Munir and team, they came up with the digital professionalism and how we share. But I think one of the things that he said just now that really made me rethink is mentioning to Winnie and Alan is this confessions thing. Yeah. Because I think, so we have a confessions page, not we, but the students have that. And almost exactly what scenarios you have given, the students think they are doing it in an anonymous manner and de-identifying. But nearly every other student knows the story and the issue. And I think this is where, because it's happening and it's really blossoming, and I actually had to deal, Ian was there, I had to deal with a case of something that came up on IMU's confession, and 2 student groups are having a argument because they're accusing each other, why did you put it on confessions? So, and I tell you, you think adults are, when you have this I was surprised at the way they were arguing with each other, and to really put it down because it evoked a lot of emotions.
Yep.
So this is really putting an area that we think is just your own personal Facebook page, this and that. But there's these other forms that when things are out, you cannot take it back.
Yep.
And it identifies people actually. Yeah.
As well, I had a staff recently who took 2 days stress-related sick leave because of what
Yep.
the person read on the confession.
Yeah.
It can be very detrimental to staff morale.
And as Vishnu pointed out, it can be very detrimental to the students as well, because someone may put up something that's very critical of someone and everyone else goes, no, 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 that person's really very good. And you end up with this argument going on. And it almost becomes destructive to the student body. It's, and it's, students do use it. I mean, we had a couple of students in first year formed a relationship, and at Christmas they each went their own way, and she came back with an engagement ring but wanted to take up the relationship with the guy as well. So she wanted to be engaged to someone overseas, and it got pretty hairy, and she confronted him in a pub one day and he tried to get away from her and she punched him. But the first thing he did was took pictures of his swollen lip and the stitches and published them online saying, look what she did to me. And that really created a lot of unease within the student body, that there was this conflict going on, that the students, it can just blow up so quickly. And I haven't come across these confessions. I've come across Rachel lecturer type sites, but if you've got school-based ones, it can be very detrimental to the staff. And sometimes, as you find with these things, it's one person or two people out of the whole cohort that have problems, and that can just really undermine the student body. It's a difficult area.
But should we as a university have a policy of engaging with these confessions patients, saying, you need to go through the proper channels if you're going to make a complaint about the staff member? This will be ignored by the university, you know, because we do have student reps, we do have a structure. They go to the CAC
They
meeting.
do the evaluations, but
Yeah.
there are two things. There's also the other argument that perhaps through these official means, the students feel things are not happening, and that's why they resort. But definitely, this talk today, I must say, put me in that perspective of what's happening in confessions, because it seems like this is a place, yes, you can do it.
Yes.
There is a perception that this is the safe place, and you say one, and we are not going to intervene. But actually, as you said, you cannot de-identify. It becomes an issue at the students,
Yeah.
and it's a matter of if any bullying or anything also happens, this could be quite serious. And handling, that means what your message to me is, every sphere needs to be having some guidelines, some
Yep.
proper mechanism.
I mean, have you talked to the students about these confession sites? Because, I mean, it's...
That's the thing. So another, I'm not saying that, but from my perspective, it's another, the student services are sort of managing it.
Yep.
And I'm not saying they should, but we should be engaging more. Definitely an area to look into. Elena, I mean, the deans are here, what do you think? Student services. So student services looking at it now. So
Right.
I don't know anyone from student services here? Yeah.
No,
So-
they're all hiding at the moment.
so we need to, definitely an area to look at. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll raise it. For me, this talk opened the spotlight here.
Yeah.
If we had a policy as a university on how we deal with these
Yeah.
accusations from a professional,
Yeah.
level, would be helpful.
You need something that the students can look at and at least make them think about doing it. Because so often what they do is they submit or put something online and then think about it afterwards. And by then it's too late because of the nature of the process.
But Mike, I have another question. It's also about staff. And while we talk about this, and the examples you had given were mainly with the students, our staff, so you are not only, we could have staff who is a medical doctor, an academic educator, right? An administrator, senior administrator for the university. So all these multiple roles. So should the rules be any different, or is it in fact more stringent? Just some views about that. How do universities deal with staff?
I don't think they should be any different. If the rules are there for the students, they should reflect the medical profession. I'm talking about medicine here, more so than perhaps some of the other areas. But certainly if they apply to the students, they should also apply to the staff. You can't have one set for students and one set for staff. That would just lead to all sorts of problems. And the students wouldn't respect it because they would see it as you're picking on them. So it's really quite, I think it has to be consistent across the board. Most of the professionalism issues come up with students because they're novices, they're new. Most of the doctors have been around long enough to understand some of the issues. As a student, I was a student back in the 60s and 70s, and we never talked about being professional or professionalism. The only time we came up against the medical board was when they had attended and said, unless you do your intern year in Adelaide, you won't get back into South Australia and be registered, because we were short of doctors. No one paid any attention to it anyway. But there was nothing about professionalism in our course. We were just assumed that we would develop it as we went through. These days, with the shortened courses, I don't think we can wait. I think we've got to get in there and educate the students early on. But it's a constant battle, as you're finding. It's something that just keeps going and going.
Any other questions, colleague?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Very